Hello, my name is Stephen Policastro, and I'm here with my friend James Stroud from the Philosophy of History. And we have our guest tonight, Dr. Lydia Mcgrew, who will be joining us to discuss a really fascinating topic. We're so glad that you guys could join us tonight. And I just wanted to thank James for all of the months of preparing these talks in conjunction with myself and so many of our friends. Thank you so much, James, for doing that. And I'm so excited to have Lydia and yourself and me together for this one last hoorah on the Philosophy of History pages. So thank you so much, and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Again, welcome to the millions watching us out there. Like Stephen said, this is our final talk of a crazy 2020, and it is truly an honor to have such an author, philosopher, I could go on, and I will here in a little bit, that pushes all sides to keep thinking, and therefore is a author after my own heart, since I oftentimes anger all sides in the name of critical thinking. And we're going to do things a little bit different than we have in our past talks. Instead of just doing a traditional PowerPoint presentation, we're going to kind of go through some of the tons of questions that I've gotten from peers, colleagues, and strangers alike leading up to this talk. So I put these questions together in a string of Q&A that Dr. Mcgrew and I will go through instead of the typical PowerPoint presentation and then, very regimented. It's going to be a little bit more open-ended questions. And it'll give Lydia plenty of time to kind of draw them out and run with them. And I do have a list of questions that I'm going to go through at the end of this, and we'll go through as many as possible. But also feel free, as usual, text any questions you might have to the number 479-616-4520. That's 479-616-4520. And if we have time, we'll go through as many of these as we can in the order they come in during our 90 minutes together this evening. So without further delay, let's go ahead and first get Lydia's website and Facebook page up on the screen, just so people can buy the book that we're going to be going through. Again, I'm missing one of the copies, but oops, there we go. Sorry, messes with my mind, the left to right thing. And watch our YouTube discussions, some really, really good stuff on there. And, I'm actually going to take directly I love her own page as far as her introduction goes. So I'm actually just going to read a few statements about her directly from her website, because I thought it just really resonated, I think. Okay, directly from LydiaMcgrew.com. I am a wife, homemaker, mother, and teacher of my children, including young adults. My husband is Timothy Mcgrew. A lot of you obviously will know him. Chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Western Michigan University, and that is my vocation. I'm very interested in the intersection of issues in biblical studies and epistemology, and there are many ways in which knowledge about independence, testimony, and evidence can be helpful in biblical studies. This sort of crossover work is desperately needed in a field such as biblical studies that has become, unfortunately, rather inward-looking. I'm an entirely traditional Christian, deity of Christ, resurrection, the whole works. Raised as a fundamental Baptist, I'm now a member of the Continuing Anglican Church, and my doctorate from Vanderbilt University is in English, but nearly all of my publications have been in philosophy. So again, we're going to start with that. And again, I encourage you guys, definitely get plugged into her YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button, follow her on Facebook, and definitely go to her website. It's not easy, it's not hard to forget, LydiaMcgrew.com. So with that last bit about Vanderbilt University, Lydia, do you care to, I did get several questions just saying, hey, it's fascinating that your PhD is in literature, yet you're considered an analytical philosopher by most and a New Testament historian by a growing number. Why philosophy and not English, and how did you get into New Testament studies?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I want to correct one thing. I need to update that on my website. Tim is full professor of philosophy, but he is no longer the chairman, which he's actually not sorry about. Being the chairman during COVID is no joke. So he was glad to have more classroom time now, but I do need to update that. And he teaches at Western Michigan University. So yeah, why philosophy? Well, I found it more interesting than English. I got my PhD in English, and I enjoyed doing that, and I was glad to have the degree, and I learned a lot. I'm not going to go on and on about that, but it was very useful and has been useful to me in studying New Testament, by the way, because of literature and just watching things that happen in the humanities and getting a broad humanities background. But I became very interested in issues of what's called epistemology, which is the area in philosophy that my husband's interested in. So we started co-writing. And then now I've kind of gone off and also published on my own. So I just got much more interested in that rigor of analytic philosophy. So that's the, why not English? But as far as New Testament studies, Tim began lecturing in apologetics and New Testament and the historical reliability of the Gospels even before I was involved in it. And I've always said, and I hope to keep this up, I want to keep doing my pure philosophy work as well. But I used to say, I don't want to do too much in New Testament because it takes me away too much from philosophy. And I've had to change on that a little bit because I got so interested. So Tim really got me interested in the argument from undesigned coincidences, which we're going to discuss later. That brought me to writing Hidden in Plain View, my first book in New Testament. And then that just sort of drew me deeper and deeper into these issues of New Testament reliability. And once I began to realize that there were so many challenges to gospel reliability that would, I believe, undermine Christianity rather seriously, then I began to devote myself in even greater amounts of time to answering those. And in some ways, a real turning point was when Tim and I wrote the article. Was sort of a background assumption of that article that we wrote. So then we realized, we needed to bring even more detail to bear on that. Also, Tim got involved with a Templeton grant to study the history of apologetics, like older apologists, and that brought in so much more evidence, and he got me excited about that too. So that's how I got into New Testament studies. Sure, those categories, they have some overlap. Obviously, people are going to work in all of those fields sometimes at the same time. But New Testament studies is sort of probably an overarching thing. But when we're talking about, for example, New Testament criticism, critical gospel scholarship, history of the historical Jesus scholarship, that kind of thing. That's going to be at the level of interpreting the New Testament. So what does it mean? Not even necessarily for theology, although theology will come in, but for history, is this historical or not? Did this really happen or not? What did Jesus mean when he said that? What are the sources that go into this? Are they were there sources that lay behind this document, that kind of thing. Then textual criticism. People will sometimes talk about textual New Testament scholarship, and they'll use that word when they really mean, New Testament criticism, like what I was just speaking about a moment ago. But textual scholarship is more specifically, do we actually have texts that convey what the authors wrote in the original documents? Regardless of who wrote them, have they been corrupted in the course of copying? So questions like scribal errors. So when you get into something like the ending of Mark, is the ending of Mark the original ending? Did it originally have a different ending, or that kind of thing? That would be textual scholarship, which is generally considered, in a sense, more conservative than critical New Testament scholarship, because, textual scholarship, we don't have all that many large questions about that. So you can have a scholar who defends the textual accuracy of the transmission of the Gospels, but then thinks that they're not historical. So you shouldn't assume that those necessarily come together. Classics is a much broader category. That's going to include like Greek literature, Roman literature, antiquity, the literature of antiquity. So, it's going to include like the dialogues of Plato. It's going to include Plutarch's Lives, a lot of non-biblical documents as well. And we do have classicists who do crossover work in New Testament. Richard Burridge, who's argued for a certain genre for the Gospels, he's a crossover scholar like that who does both classics and New Testament. And I disagree with him quite a bit about New Testament, but not because he's a classicist, just because I disagree with him. So that's sort of a broad overview of those categories.
Perfect. Nope, I think that's a perfect introduction. And just to really help introduce our audience to the heart of your work, I think it's a good compare and contrast, basically, would be when Bart Ehrman, who, for anyone that doesn't know, you can Google the name or YouTube it, great debate, side note, between him and your husband, Tim, but he's a New Testament textualist who has written many best-selling books against the reliability of the New Testament. And when he was debating Mike Licona at one point, he finally said, well, this isn't going to be a very good debate since Mike agrees with me on practically everything. Now, with that in mind, if Mike Licona is considered a moderate and a prolific defender of the reliability of scriptures, and yet Bart Ehrman says that they agree on most everything, what does that tell us about kind of the progressive nature, if that's the right word, of New Testament criticism today from evangelicals? And, and really, where would you differ from both Licona and Ehrman in a nutshell?
Yeah, in a nutshell. So we'll be getting into a lot of this, I think, more as this interview goes on, but an approach to apologetics, which is the defense of the Christian faith, that's been going on for a couple decades at least, is an approach where what the Christian tries to do is to see how little he actually has to defend as a set of premises. So he tries to get these premises that he says, well, so many other scholars agree with me on this, even if they're not Christians. So I'll just try to use those, the things that the non-Christians agree with me on, and then I'll try to defend Christianity, like the resurrection, that Jesus rose from the dead or something like that. And I disagree with that approach, but it's very, very popular. And then what's happened is I call this calling the bluff of the minimal facts approach. So the minimalist or minimal facts approach, you're trying to do that. And then so you're kind of saying, even if the gospel authors changed a lot of things, we could still defend Christianity, even if. So that's what I call the bluff of the minimal facts approach. Dr. Licona has come along in a way and sort of under, I think, partly Bart Ehrman sort of calling that bluff. He's come along and he said, well, yeah, I actually think they did change quite a number of things. And he has a lot of specifics for this. And that's part of what Ehrman meant by that comment, that and Dr. Licona will attribute it to genre and so forth, but that they changed this and they changed that. And I don't believe that the gospel authors ever knowingly told anything that appears historical that they didn't believe was true. I don't think they ever went in there and said, oh, I know it happened this way, but I'll make it happen this way. So that's where I differ with both of them. And I would take a much more, I would say, forward stance in any dispute with Dr. Ehrman. And, what he'd probably say about me is, well, you're out of touch with the majority of scholars or something like that, but it wouldn't be what he said there to Dr. Licona.
No, I think that's perfect. And also, shameless plug, literally the first book I read of yours was a review of Mike Licona's book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And I thought it was really good. I know there's also YouTube going back and forth, but that book really, I think, articulated that. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Craig Blomberg also had critiqued that work in a similar fashion. But your book, again, highly recommended, really breaks it down piece by piece, I think. And most of the evening you kind of touched on will be spent on your latest book, The Mirror of the Mask, what we'll refer to as T-Mom. But hidden in plain view was your earlier book, and Stephen will probably flash that picture up for us. And it has gotten a lot of attention. And I found it not only incredibly original, but it seemed to only take a few hours just to read through it. I mean, I started and I was just done, and I'm like, wow, that just flew by. And though our discussion is focused more on T-Mom, we have had some really good questions on undesigned coincidences. I've seen many, for example, Bart Ehrman just kind of waved their hand, and just kind of attribute this as a 19th century apologetic method, which seemed a little bit genetic fallacy kind of there. But can you just kind of touch on just that book briefly and how it tied into your work with the Mirror of the Mask? Quick example, John 6, that's pretty easy. Jesus asked Philip where to buy bread for the 5,000. Well, why Philip? Well, John gives no explanation, but in Luke 9, we're told the feeding occurred near Bethsaida, where Philip was from. So, I mean, you start looking at these and you're like, how did I miss that? But yeah, can you expound on that just a little bit? And I still haven't really heard any good rebuttal other than just kind of like Ehrman did, where he just waves his hand and that's about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, and thank you for summarizing that undesigned coincidence. I say that an undesigned coincidence is this incidental interlocking that points to truth. And as you saw on the front cover of Hidden in Plain View, it's got a jigsaw puzzle there. So the idea is that these accounts fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And the example that you just gave, James, it brings together different passages in John that aren't even in the same place about the feeding of the 5,000, and also a brief mention in Luke of where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. I'm about to begin a series on my YouTube channel about the feeding of the 5,000. So, everybody subscribe to my YouTube channel for that. I'm doing a whole series on miracle accounts in the Gospels, and this is something entirely fresh. I've never done it before in just this way. I don't know if anybody else who's doing this, where I'm taking specific miracles in the Gospels and I'm talking about, what sort of a naturalistic hypothesis could someone try to say it could explain this, without it being a miracle, and what marks of credibility are there on this particular account and that kind of thing. So the idea is that Jesus turns to his disciple Philip and he says, where can we buy bread for these to eat? Because it's this big crowd and it's been all day. I often say we should think of the feeding of the 5,000 as being more like a fair than a lecture. So it's like an all day, like you go to the fair or something. And Jesus is doing a meet and greet. He's going in and out. He's talking to people all day long. It even says he was healing people, and then it's evening, and they don't have enough to eat. And so he turns to Philip and says, hey, Philip, where can we buy bread for these to eat? And of course, he doesn't really want them to go buy bread, right? But so the question is, well, was it just that Philip happened to be the guy standing there? Did John make up this story and he just went eeny, meeny, miny, mo among the 12 disciples and he happened to pick Philip, or what? Probability 1 out of 12. And it's actually probably lower because Philip isn't the most prominent disciple, or is there some reason? Like if it really happened in reality, there would be some reason. And so then you go to other passages in John completely unrelated. And he just mentions in passing Philip was from Bethsaida. Again, not apropos of the feeding at all. He just mentions it elsewhere casually. And we really need to get a sense of the importance of casualness, by the way, as a mark of truth. I just want to throw that in there. That, instead of all these hyper literary theories, when somebody just says something casually and then it's confirmed by somebody else saying something casually, that's really a mark of truth. So then you go to the account of the feeding in Luke, and it mentions that this took place in a deserted place near the town of Bethsaida. So you put all of that together, and Jesus is saying it to Philip because he's kind of trolling them, if you want to put it that way. He's kind of pulling their chains. Hey, Philip, where can we go to buy bread that these people may eat? And that's because Philip is from nearby. At least I think that's the best explanation. So that's just a nifty little example, and there's just no plausible explanation for John coming along later and going, Luke says this happened near Bethsaida. I think I'll drop a little seed over here in this other account that this happened near Bethsaida. that Philip was from Bethsaida. It appears to have nothing to do with anything. And then I'll drop it over here, another little seed that Philip was from Bethsaida, and then maybe some clever young lad 2,000 years from now will read this and will go, cool, it all fits together. Obviously not. That's not how this works. He's just telling it because he knows that Jesus, in fact, said this to Philip. In fact, he may not even have been thinking about the fact that it was near Bethsaida when he reported this. There's no sign of John making any connection, but it fits together because it was true, because Jesus really had this conversation. So that's an example of what we call an undesigned coincidence, and it confirms the truth of the accounts. Now, this does fit with the mirror or the mask, T-Mom, because it really defends, thank you, it really defends what I call the reportage model of the Gospels, and so does Hidden in Plain View fit the reportage model of the Gospels, because in both cases, what we're talking about is the Gospel authors just telling what's true. They're just telling it as they remember it, or as the people they're interviewing, the witnesses remember it, and then these little marks of truth come out because it's based on truth, not because they're trying to do this heavy literary or theological thing. And both Hidden in Plain View and The Mirror or the Mask are defending that model of the Gospels and showing that there's a lot of evidence for it.
There we go. Forgot to hit the mute button, unmute. Perfect. Nope, I think that's great. And I think there's going to be some really good, I'm not going to jump to the end, but I think there was some great connections also with the Gospel of John that we'll save for the end. But now it is time to get into the meat and potatoes. Woo! I always get that screen wrong. And that is The Mirror or the Mask. And before we go there directly, can you touch upon, because I had almost forgotten about it. I think I'd heard the notion. I think it was Chesterton. I could be wrong, but I think in my undergraduate studies way back in the day, and that was just this notion of the democracy of the dead. And I think it was brilliant how you kind of fleshed that out. But why is that important to at least consider when someone tells you today, look, I'm sorry, the majority of New Testament scholarship says X, Y, Z, that settles it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need to be really careful about that. You get a lot of that. You'll see if you watch the back and forth that you mentioned between me and Dr. Lacona from this summer, the video series that we did, he'll bring that up a lot. Craig Evans brought this up when I debated him on the Unbelievable Show about the Gospel of John back in 2018. The majority of scholars, I don't think there's a single New Testament scholar today who says this, and so on and so on. And what happens with that is that we get really locked into our own time period. Those who happen to be alive at the same time we are, or maybe they just lived a little while ago before we did. And that's very narrow window, really, of human beings, and it's funny because it'll be sometimes billed as, we're broadening you conservatives need to broaden your minds, but it's not actually broadening, because the people who live close to one another in time and are all going to schools where they've got the same, they're reading the same textbooks and they're responding and they're in a certain milieu, they'll tend to influence one another. And if you can break out of this, you can get a different perspective. And that's really something that Tim and I have tried to do. And this is why Tim does historical apologetics. He has a website with older books called the Library of Historical Apologetics, because these older scholars, they had a different perspective. And I think their perspective can be an important corrective to ours right now. So when people say you're disagreeing with the majority of scholars, I'll say, oh, which majority of scholars? Do you mean the majority of the scholars that they respected in your graduate program, or the majority of the scholars who've ever lived, or, whom are you including here? So that doesn't even necessarily mean that majority is right either. But it does mean that at least we can get some alternative perspectives on these things, and maybe question some biases that have been brought in more modern times.
Absolutely. And building on that, if you were fleshing out, let's say, how evangelical scholars have claimed that the gospel writers were allowed to, these literary conventions, or to simply just assert where they may have just invented narratives, kind of like your analogy on based on a true story, and why just at the macro level, and then we'll go more into it. But why do you believe that this position is weak, if not outright false? Kind of like as you argue in The Mirror of the Mass.
Right. So their idea is that there was this genre, or there were these conventions, literary conventions, where the authors were just allowed to change things, sometimes invent things. Some of them would be small, some of them will be large. You'll see it said, oh, it's only these teeny little things. Well, no, I mean, it's not only these teeny little things. I give a lot of examples, but even on the smaller things, and that this was just expected. Sort of like if we go to a movie based on true events, we expect that they're going to change some of the events. They'll make people say things that sound more memorable than they really did. Maybe they'll make the climactic scene more dramatic than it really was. Maybe they'll change some years when things happen, and they might even make up whole characters that didn't exist. And that's fine with us. If we want to know the facts, we'll look it up on the internet or something to find out the facts in a more literal sense. Of course, there wasn't any internet back there, and the Gospels were the things that the authors were using, and that the early church was using to try to find out about Jesus. So they didn't have any other way to look it up. They could maybe conjecture by comparing them, but that would be highly conjectural. So I tackle this from a lot of different angles in The Mirror of the Mask. I tackle the ancient literature that these scholars claim to be using. I tackle the verses that they claim to be interpreting in the Gospels to say that these are examples of these literary devices. I tackle the idea of a different ancient way of looking at things. So there'll be this. I just saw somebody today on a comments thread on a YouTube channel where I was interviewed, and he said, we Westerners are concerned, this commentator, we're concerned with the way things literally happen, but people who had an Eastern mindset, by which he was apparently including, gospel authors, the early church, people with an Eastern mindset, they're not concerned with what literally happened. And I said, no, you're wrong. I said, that's a meme. Or sometimes they'll do modern and ancient. And I tackle that, and I refute that evidence. And then I also bring forward evidence of their actually being very concerned with literal truth. And I even use this phrase, fake points don't make points. So when the author John says that Jesus' legs were not broken in this fulfilled prophecy, not a bone of him shall be broken, he would not have believed that, and he doesn't believe that he can make an historical point and a prophecy point, not a bone shall be broken, if Jesus' legs really were broken. Like, it only works to show the marvelous providence of God in fulfilling this if that's how it really happened. And it's very, very clear that the author of the Gospel of John thinks that way. And that's why he says right in that context, he who saw it bore record, and his record is true. So that's, maybe that's several nutshells, but why I think that view is wrong. I've got a lot of different reasons why I think that view is undersupported and incorrect.
Nope, I think that's perfect. And just to kind of flesh that out just a little bit more, if you were reading, let's just say, Irenaeus, Africanus, Papias, Clement, anybody, and you would not get the notion just from reading their writings that they would have allowed just these inventions of narratives like Lacona and some of the more progressive scholarship today would assert, would you?
Those guys you just named, absolutely not. And I would say in general, the church fathers were very literal minded. I can think of one exception, and that's Origen. And he is an exception. Origen is unusual in a lot of ways. And so particularly when there's an apparent discrepancy between John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on the other hand, Origen says, we should interpret John spiritually or something like that. But he is an outlier. And I show that very clearly. I give a bunch of quotations, and quite frankly, from the New Testament authors themselves, like the one I just gave from John. The one in Peter where it says, "We have not followed cunningly devised fables." Papias said that Mark made it his concern not to falsify anything. And I think what you find with these modern scholars is they have to like put a little asterisk by each one of those statements. Well, and actually Richard Burridge, the classicist I mentioned earlier, he's very explicit about this. He talks about talking to a student, and the student says, how can John keep fabricating details about Jesus when he keeps saying he's telling the truth? Well, that's a very good question. And Burridge says, well, the negative connotation of fabrication is modern, he says. So basically, every time the authors are asserting we're interested in the truth, not falsifying, no devised fables, they're like, well, he doesn't, that doesn't mean what you think it means. That doesn't mean what you think it means. That doesn't, it's like, it's very ad hoc. They're having to explain away all of this evidence for a concern for literal truth. I would also mention, since I brought up Origen, it's very interesting when he says that we should not try to harmonize John with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He doesn't bring up literary devices. He says that is his own view, and it is his view in some of these areas, but he never says, because, guys, we all know, we're all ancient men, that there are these literary devices, and that's just how we ancient men are allowed to write. He makes no allusion to that whatsoever. I actually read a transcript of a Q&A where a fellow scholar brought this up, and he asked Mike Licona, was Origen aware of these literary devices? And he said, oh, that's an interesting question. I can't say that he ever really was. And yet in his responses to me this past summer, he said that Origen was aware of the literary devices, and all he quoted and cited was Origen's own theory of interpreting these contradictions non-literally. That's not the same thing as claiming that there was a widely spread compositional device or convention or genre, which even Origen never says. So we find absolutely no awareness of that at all in the extant church fathers, which I think is very striking, that suddenly you have these 21st century scholars saying, oh yeah, this whole genre that was like movies based on true events, and they can't find a single actual allusion to it in a single church father, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, and actually, you pretty much just answered the sub bullet point that someone else had asked, which was, as both a philosopher and a literary PhD, can you touch upon where the burden of proof lies if we believe, for example, Mike Licona says Africanus was simply inventing something. Africanus is saying, no, I wasn't. I mean, wouldn't the burden of proof lie insanely heavily on Licona? And I think you kind of discussed that in chapter 9 of the
Yeah,
Narrative
well,
Acts.
burden of proof is a fascinating topic that, as a theorist of knowledge, I deal with quite a lot. And this is part of what I do with my flow chart. I have a flow chart in the Mirror or the Mask because I'm trying to kind of slow people down. Because what you'll find is the scholars will find an apparent discrepancy and they go, whoop, from apparent discrepancy to fact-changing compositional device in one step, and I'll be like, well, what about, wait a minute, okay, we've got an apparent discrepancy. Well, can we harmonize it? Okay, how about, especially if we're talking about Plutarch, it's not even a biblical work. Well, could it be a mistake? Nobody's committed to the inerrancy of Plutarch, right? He was an ancient, historian. I mean, nobody thinks he couldn't have made a mistake. Or again, if we're really going to say that an author changed this, well, nowadays we have propaganda. When somebody changes the facts in a news story, you don't say, yeah, we have a literary device that means we, you're just allowed to do that. It's like, no, he's trying to, manipulate people. Now, I don't think the gospel authors were trying to manipulate people. Of course not. But if you're going to say that they were deliberately changing the facts, what's your argument that they weren't? You can't just automatically say, well, we've got this controversy between two gospels. Whoop, must be that there was an accepted literary device. That doesn't follow from a mere appearance of discrepancy. So we've got all of these different layers where there are common things that we know that happen in real life that cause apparent discrepancies, sometimes just differences of perspective, and they turn out that they're both right, and so forth. In two people who witness a car accident or something. And so why not go with those kinds of causes rather than constructing this sort of infrastructure of a widely societally accepted set of compositional devices where they just expected people to change things merely on the basis of what I call discrepancy hunting. That's not a good method. So yeah, definitely the burden of proof would lie there, and I would say they haven't satisfied it or even come close, really.
No, I couldn't agree more. And just to give the audience kind of a little bit of an example, if someone said, "Hey, Dr. Mcgrew, why would Matthew make up the involvement of James and John's mother in asking Jesus to let them sit on his right and left hand side? Do we have good evidence to believe that they simply invented these elements, as some would suggest?"
Right, so it's an example I give in T-Mom. There's this minor difference. I would not call it even a apparent discrepancy. When one gospel author says that the James and John's mother came and knelt before Jesus and said, and he's like, "What's the request?" And she says, that my sons may sit on one in your right hand, one in your left, and then another gospel author says that it's that they came and asked. And so a couple, I don't even consider that a discrepancy because I think it's quite clear they're all there at once. They all three come, and mom is like dramatically kneeling before Jesus, and James and John are there nodding, everything she's saying, they're asking, she's asking, they're all asking at once, even if she's the one who actually is the spokeswoman, as it were, for them. But one possible, resolution, which is suggested by scholar Craig Evans in his commentary on Matthew, is that Matthew may have added the mother, like just added her to the scene, like as if she wasn't really there, but that she came in and did it instead of attributing it to James and John. And that's just, it's amazing how the so-called solution is so far out of proportion to the so-called problem. The so-called problem is like trivial, and the so-called solution is gigantic. And this happens in more cases than one. There are other alleged contradictions. A pretty famous one that I have a whole series on my YouTube channel, so subscribe to my YouTube channel and watch it, is the temple cleansing, because some people think that John moved the temple cleansing. John talks about Jesus going in there, driving out the money changers early in his ministry, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about his going and driving out the money changers late in his ministry, and is this a contradiction? When was it? I think he did it twice. I think it's obvious he did it twice. It was a kind of protest. As we have certainly learned during the year 2020, people can carry out the same kind of protest on more than one occasion. It is not confined. It's not like, oh, somebody must have, moved this to Atlanta because it really took place in Kenosha. Obviously the people do the same kinds of things on more than one occasion. And if Jesus was offended by these practices in the temple, then 3.5 years later, 4 years later, that he would have done the same thing again. I just don't see as a problem at all. But I do answer some of the objections. That's another of these supposed compositional devices that John said, well, I know he did it late, but I'm going to make it in my story early. I'm going to make it a different time. And I want to make it clear, this is not just saying like he narrated it earlier in his gospel. It's supposed to be that he actually makes it happen at a different time in the story in his gospel. And that's what I mean by a fact-changing literary device. And then they make up these elaborate theological symbolism that John is trying to do. I could make up a theological symbolism for Mark to move it to the end, You want me to do it? Sure. Here we go. Mark moved it to the end because he wanted to show Jesus mercy in giving them chances to repent. And it really happened at the beginning. I'm making this up, you understand. I don't really think this, but it really happened at the beginning. But Mark wanted to show that Jesus was more loving and merciful and waited, and that he only got really exasperated and came in there and drove them out after they had rejected him at the end of his ministry. See how easy that you can do this all day. So that's an example of, those are a couple examples of these literary devices.
And that, I think, is perfect. And this is kind of tying back up, concluding Mirror and the Mask, the part of this. So again, everyone, definitely go to lydiamcgrew.com, go to the YouTube. To your point, yeah, I just finished watching, I think you just posted it yesterday, or I lose track of time, but on the temple cleansing, you had several sections. Fascinating. Definitely go out there, subscribe, also follow her on Facebook, and definitely get this book. Now, one of the final little questions on Mirror the Mask is, basically, it's kind of alluding to, why is it healthy to review the historicity and the credibility from a multitude of angles? One reason that I love your approach is, well, first of all, it's refreshing. It's not saying, hey, we're Western 21st century Christians. We know so much more than everyone else ever did. It's kind of taking everything together and saying, no, that's not necessarily the case. We can add, obviously, new things to it, but where does, what would your elevator speech be here? And then the one rhetorical question that I got here from somebody, Ted and Nancy want to know if they can simply read the Gospels and have faith that they are correct. And they don't need a, they put a name, I'll leave the name out, a professional scholar to show what part is out of order, or where, this time they did say Lacona thinks that the author might have took liberties and invented this element, take it out, like splice it back up, almost kind of like you would expect, almost a soft version of the Jesus seminar back from like the 90s. So basically, yeah, can they read it and have faith that they're correct?
Yeah, so the problem is that a New Testament scholar will say, well, Ted and Nancy need some help, right? I mean, we've got supposed contradictions here, and that's why they have a pastor, presumably Ted and Nancy, we're all in favor of being educated. We don't want people to just be ignorant and so forth. But at the same time, what I like to say about my approach is I view myself as making common sense rigorous. So what I'm doing is I'm taking an approach to the Gospels that I think Ted and Nancy kind of do take, when they read it. And I'm not saying that they never need to learn anything. Maybe they didn't know that the long ending of Mark is something that may not have originally been part of Mark. So there are, especially in the textual area, there might be a few corrections that need to be made. Or maybe it never occurred to them that it looks like there's a contradiction in a certain place. Maybe they never thought of that, or they never thought about an answer. So certainly we need to be digging deep into the Word, giving thought to these objections that can be made, and thinking about what kind of intelligent answers we can give to them. But at the same time, when we're imagining the authors as making these invisible changes, it looks like Jesus did this. It looks like Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, or I am the true vine, but actually that was the creation of the Johannine community. Then it's going to be hard. It's not just going to be hard for Ted and Nancy in the pews. It's going to be hard for Pastor Jones, Ted and Nancy's pastor. He went to seminary. He supposedly is educated, and he still can't get up and preach on I am the true vine because maybe Jesus didn't really say it. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a reportage model, which is, it's nuanced. It's not just uneducated and ignorant and naive, but at the same time, it is a very commonsensical, historical, robustly historical approach to the Gospels. And then I'm showing what reasons we have for this, and in what ways it needs to be polished and made nuanced, made precise, and defended. But the fact that it really can stand up to scrutiny. And so, I'm not saying that our hypothetical Ted and Nancy are going to agree with all of my positions and everything I have to say about every passage, but I think they're definitely going to find that my approach is defending, at least in general, the kind of common sense on the face of it, approach that they have always taken to the Gospels, but defending it in a rigorous and a scholarly way.
Nope, I think that is perfect. Now, shifting gears as we hit the 45-minute marker, perfect timing. I controlled the whole conversation, so we get us right back. The next one, and again, I've kind of grouped these in buckets and then kind of bulleted them, but we had a series of questions that kind of went back to your and Tim's article on the resurrection. I've got a lot of people that really like and it's a beast, the Blackwell Companion. But can you kind of differentiate or walk us through, because I got quite a few questions on minimal facts. People usually think of Habermas, Lacona, William Lane Craig, versus basically the Paley concept. We have reports, of people who have interacted with Jesus. They were either deceived, deceivers, or telling the truth. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit where you differentiate and where you think if you go too minimal, all of a sudden you're cutting out the meat and potatoes in a lot of ways?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so Tim and I wrote that article, and it's been a number of years, but we very self-consciously did not take either minimal facts or what I think of as a more minimalist approach. At the time, I think we did not fully realize just how skeptical the skeptical scholars are, but we would not have cared if we did. In other words, if we had realized, like there's one sentence in that article that I would write differently now. So, one sentence isn't too bad after 11 years, where we said that we thought that the majority of scholars would grant that at least this, as told in the Gospels, is what the original witnesses claimed. That's at least what they said. That the disciples got up and actually, under conditions of persecution, said, we met with him, we talked with him, we could touch him, we ate with him, we met with him on multiple occasions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had long conversations, and that this was at least what they claimed. And then we went ahead giving a probability theoretic version of that Paley style argument you just gave. Now, I have a website YouTube video I just put up recently where I think it was 16 minutes long, so not very long. I did that Paley style argument, and I talked about it more, and I showed how all of the evidence we brought on the reliability of the Gospels comes into play there. That doesn't mean I gave all that evidence. I couldn't do that in 16 minutes, but I showed how it intersects with that, because what that means is that these stories we have are not embellished. We're not granting, not even for the sake of the argument, that, oh, well, for all we know, that thing about his eating fish, that might have been something somebody made up, or we don't know how many times he really met with his disciples, I mean, there's a place in Dr. Lacona's 2010 book where he actually says, on at least one occasion, the disciples had a group experience of the risen Jesus. But we don't know how many different occasions, or whether they had experiences, whether Thomas had this kind of experience, like, doubting Thomas, or as historians, that doesn't mean he doesn't believe it, but as historians, that may be going beyond the data to assert this. So we don't go that way. We say, at least this was asserted by them. At least Thomas was out there saying, yes, I didn't believe it. And then a week later, I saw him. And so then we have to say, well, was he just lying or what? And how do we get to that? Well, we get to that by arguing that the Gospels are reliable, so that they're recounting the stories that came from people who were the witnesses. That doesn't mean we're assuming it's true, because that would be question begging, of course. But then we take an inference to the best explanation. We say, well, if this is really what they went out there and they said, under danger of death, and the detailed things, and those details make it very hard for them to be wrong, like in some honestly mistaken way. People will say, well, some people think they've seen Elvis alive, Elvis sightings, right? Okay, maybe you even have sincere people who think they've seen Elvis, but they were mistaken, right? But that's not the same thing as somebody, he's like, Jesus is their best friend. This is like you being mistaken about you and a bunch of your friends spending spring break hanging out with your best friend. you guys can't all be mistaken about that in an ordinary, obvious way. I mean, unless you've all just been struck with a type of hallucination never before seen in history. So that's how we argue. And I think it's pretty strikingly different from that minimalist approach where you're trying to say, well, let's just grab some things that are granted by the majority of scholars, and then I don't have to argue that the Gospels aren't embellished. I can say, well, maybe if these even if I grant that these accounts are embellished, I can still give a good argument for the resurrection. I think that's very hard to do, and so that's how our approach is different.
Nope, I think that's perfect. And just kind of building on that, and this is kind of me bulleting a bunch of different questions into one. Progressives like William Lane Craig, growing more and more so, it seems like, Craig Evans, Mike Licona, Craig Keener, they seem to be kind of abandoning, let's say, something like the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, which was framed and signed by R.C. Sproul, J.I. Packer, Roger Nicole, John MacArthur, Francis Schaeffer, Geisler, McDowell, John Ward Montgomery, and almost 300 other scholars in, I believe it was 1978. Now, inerrancy aside, is it just that all of these scholars were simply wrong, and yet, the William Lane Craigs and the Evans and the Laconas are just that much smarter today, or does this kind of go back to that democracy of the dead kind of a thing?
Well, now I just want to note that progressive was your word, okay? I didn't call all those guys progressives. But anyway, and I might divide them up, some of them being more progressive than others. But I do think inerrancy is being redefined. And as we'll get into probably later in this interview, I don't identify myself as an inerrantist. And for that very reason, I find that the old style inerrantists are very friendly to me because they prefer that you not redefine it. They'd rather you just say, I'm not, than that you say, oh, no, I'm an inerrantist. How dare you say I'm not an inerrantist? And then it's like you've got, again, an asterisk, like that asterisk I said by the word truth. Now you have an asterisk by the word inerrancy, and you've defined it differently. So, I think they're definitely abandoning it. And I think part of the reason is that harmonization of the Gospels has gotten a very bad rap. And so they feel increasingly, I think as the decades have passed, these scholars have felt increasingly uncomfortable with doing either of the following two things, either a traditional harmonization. So you get something like, when did Jesus cleanse the temple, for example, or when did Jesus curse the fig tree, for example. And there's an alleged discrepancy. And one thing you can do is some kind of a traditional harmonization there. They get very uncomfortable doing that. And then because they think it's strained, or they feel that it's strained, or they're made to feel that that's very ad hoc, and you're just desperately trying to bring your theological presupposition of inerrancy. And they don't like that because they want to be scholars of integrity. They want to be rigorous scholars. So they don't like to do that because they've been told that's not rigorous. And then they don't want to say, well, I'm not sure, maybe there's something we just don't know. And so the older style inerrantists, they would unabashedly harmonize, and they saw, I think rightly, that can be very good historical practice. I'm not an inerrantist, and I harmonize all the time. I think it's actually a really good historical practice, and it fits what we know of history outside of the Bible also, that you'll find that these things that you would have said, oh, that can't both be true, and then they turn out that they are both true, But then the old-fashioned inerrantists, when they weren't satisfied with any of the existing harmonizations, or they said, yeah, I just don't really like any of those, they would just say, I'm not sure, I don't know. And I think the emergence of the debate format in apologetics, where you're out there, it's very very agonistic, very antagonistic. You're out there, you're being whacked by Bart Ehrman over and over again, or you're debating on YouTube, social media, or it's a videotape debate. That doesn't go over very well with the audience, to just say, oh, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure when Jesus cleansed the fig tree or whatever. You want to have something to say. And so a phrase like, oh, it was a compositional device of their time, it makes you sound like you really know what you're talking about, and like you can deal with a whole boatload of these alleged contradictions all in one fell swoop. Can we combine a boatload and a swoop? I think I'm mixing metaphors, but anyway, that you can take a lot of these and you can just go, oh, they're all taken care of. Those are all just compositional devices. In fact, I've seen William Lane Craig say this. He says he was responding to a deconversion. This would have been about a year ago. I think it was Marty Sampson. He was a worship leader who deconverted. I'm sure you heard about that. And he brought up alleged contradictions in the Gospels, and he said, nobody wants to talk about this, which is absurd because, everybody talks about it. But anyway, William Lane Craig did a podcast where he responded, and he said, most of these, he might have said most or all, but I think he said most of these can be dealt with by way of the work that Michael Licona has done on compositional devices. Now that sounds great. It's a really good soundbite that you could just say, oh, Marty, you just need to be more educated. If you just really understood the standards of the time, we could just take care of most of these. And so that feels really good to them. And then they can hold on to their inerrantist card too, because inerrancy is always allowed for, genre, standards of the time, and so forth. So it's kind of like you can have it all. And I think that's really how this has emerged. So in an odd way, they're being dogged by inerrancy. They're being, instead of just saying this was just an honest error. And I've actually had people say, I was told not to listen to you because you're not an inerrantist. And I'm like, well, you know what? The old inerrantists would prefer that I would just come out, you'd just come out and say this was an error rather than saying that the author changed something or made something up, because that's going to call his truthfulness into question way, way more, just as it would in ordinary life. So it's been very interesting to see historically how inerrancy has in an odd way driven these claims far more, I would say, than historical evidence.
No, I think that's beautiful answer. And it's funny. As soon as you mentioned that, I started thinking of your husband, Tim, debating Bart Ehrman. Well, Ehrman, when he wasn't answering the questions, he finally just started saying, are you an inerrantist? Are you an inerrantist? And Tim said, I'm not answering that. That's not the topic here. Let's focus. But it was funny because he was trying to almost back him into a corner, set up a straw man so he could start. And then when Tim just said, I'm not answering the question either way, let's focus on the topic, Ehrman seemed like he didn't really know what to do. So, and again, anybody listening, I would highly recommend that debate. It was really, I mean, I'm not just saying because you're on here, but I really enjoyed that debate. It was very original. Well, building on what we were just talking about, the odd thing is, from at least my research, and again, it's in classical and ancient history and the philosophy of history, but I'm not in your league. But from my limited research through New Testament studies, it seems like if we're looking at, let's say, the 1970s, 1980s, it seems like the New Testament credibility, whether you're going through the Jesus Seminar, whether you're going through a growing consensus of scholars, at least looking at the resurrection as a plausible theory, through the various historical Jesus quests, that the trustworthiness in Scripture, since these guys signed in 1978, really has done nothing but increase. So that's one question. Would you agree there? And then secondly, it seems like someone like yourself and Craig Blomberg would fall much more in line with a Francis Schaeffer or an R.C. Sproul than a Craig Evans or a Craig Keener. Is that a fair statement?
Okay, yeah, so I'll take those separately. As far as the credibility that particularly mainstream scholars have given to the New Testament, that has grown. I think that's true. Someone like E.P. Sanders or Jimmy Dunn, he just passed away recently, Professor Dunn, would be a stronger amount of credibility to the Gospel's historicity than, your old style, your Bultmann style skeptics. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't overestimate that, because those scholars, Sanders and Dunn, to just give a couple of examples, they were still pretty skeptical. And so I think what was happening was the stick had been bent to such an exaggerated extent against the historicity of the Gospels. It was just insane, you know? So then we got a bit of a correction taking place, but it was only a little bit of a correction. And then, in a sense, I do feel that some evangelical scholars have overestimated the extent of that correction. So then they've been out there, you know, having a party, like, oh wow, you know, we're getting the mainstream scholars. They're admitting this. They're admitting this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and they're admitting that maybe Paul believed in a physical resurrection. You know, woohoo, you know, pass the champagne, and then they think that they've been handed enough that they can just build on that. Okay, it's like they can say, okay, you know, give me. It's like Archimedes said, you know, give me a lever and a fixed point, and I'll move the world. You know, give me E.P. Sanders and a fixed point, and I'll move the world. I'll make you a good resurrection argument for Christianity. And I don't think that that's enough. So I don't think that it's taken us far enough. I think we need to push farther than that, and it not sort of rest on our laurels, and certainly not say, okay, then we'll come and we'll kind of meet them in the middle. You know, the mainstream scholars have come to this point, so we'll come over and we'll come to this point, and then we'll meet them hard, you know, and we'll make an argument for Christianity just on the basis of what they're now willing to grant. So that's one thing. Then as far as, you know, Dr. Blomberg and I think we agree quite a bit on the historicity of the Gospels, and we take a similar position. I tend to word my positions more strongly than Dr. Blomberg tends to word them. There are some rhetorical differences, and you know, I mean, I'm not saying we agree about every passage, but I think we both definitely would say that the Gospels are historical in a recognizable way. So when we're talking about Jesus saying something, you know, I don't want to put words in Dr. Blomberg's mouth, but I think he and I would both tend to say, yeah, if you'd been there, you could have seen that Jesus was actually saying this if you knew the original languages. Not that it's being reported verbatim, but that it's a recognizable historical incident that happened in a way that is told in the Gospels such that you could have recognized if you'd been there. So I think, and certainly that's in touch with, you know, these older scholars, you know, at a minimum, that the older people like Francis Schaeffer and Sproul and those guys, they definitely believed in a sort of a reportage approach like that, I think. And I think that is fair to say.
It's the mute button. All right, this is on to one of my favorite parts. Again, everyone, LydiaMcgrew.com. Follow her on YouTube. Lots of good stuff. It seems like your YouTube channel, I don't know, over the last 6, 7, 8 months, has just kind of blown up. There's all kinds of stuff on there now.
I didn't even have one 8 months ago. It's brand new.
Because it was literally like, it was sometime, in my mind, I can't remember when COVID hit now, but March sometime, it was like looking around, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, Lydia has a channel. Then I looked, and then here lately I just keep getting reminders, new video, new video, new video. So definitely everyone go out there and subscribe. And one of the books that honestly I'm looking really forward to, because I think that it's been one that a lot of scholars, and unfortunately Christian scholars, have shied away from, and that's the Gospel of John. They always, the Synoptic Gospels. Now and just now it's getting back to the Gospels. Before it's like only Paul's letters. But you have got a book coming up specifically on the, well, I don't know if that's the right word, but we'll just say, you can correct me, credibility of the Gospel of John, called The Eye of the Beholder, that's going to come out spring. Is that correct?
Lord willing, spring of 2021. Yes.
So everyone be on the lookout for that. If we knew what it looked like, we'd put a picture up on the screen. But
it's a secret.
I was going to say, I figured it was. That keeps the anticipation going. Now, we've seen a great deal of good work on the historical reliability of the Gospel of John kind of in the past, and then it kind of completely went underground. We've seen a little bit, you know, for example, Craig Blomberg, I think, did a book on, or a little bit of a study on the reliability of the Gospel of John, and you've had some more popularizers, short excerpts. I think Frank Turek did something on one. But at the same time, you know, someone like, let's just say, you know, Craig Evans is almost, even though Christian scholar, is going to completely throw it out almost 100%. How, basically, why is that, and why could you pretty much not disagree with him enough on that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and of course, Dr. Evans disagreed with that characterization of his position when I debated him on The Unbelievable Show. That, oh no, I think the Gospel of John is historical, but what he means by that is that it contains history in it. Okay, that it has history in it. And there's a big difference between having history in it and being historical. Those are not the same thing. And he referred to them in his debate in 2012 with Bart Ehrman as nuggets. So I actually have a section in The Eye of the Beholder called "Hold the Nuggets." So it's kind of a play. Of course, he meant nuggets in the sense of little nuggets of gold, and I mean nuggets like chicken nuggets. Hold the nuggets. So but it's this idea that you have bits of history in the gospel, but to say that it's historical overall is very dubious in his view. And again, Dr. Evans will characterize that, oh, well, all I'm saying is that Jesus' words are not verbatim. That's not all he's saying. Actually, he has said that when you have these I am sayings with what are called predicates, so I am the true vine, I am the light of the world, I am the bread of life, that these were the creations of the Johannine community because Jesus was to them the bread of life and the way, the truth, and the life. So it's their interpretation of Jesus' theology, and that they then invented that he said these things to express his theology. And it's true in the sense that it's true to his message or something like that. It's very, very non-historical view of that. And he even admitted eventually in his debate with me on The Unbelievable Show, though he was, I would say, dodging. I would say definitely dodging and not making his position clear. But he did admit that he believes that when Jesus says these things, he looks like an allegorical character. And he even likened Jesus to Lady Wisdom in the book of Proverbs. And, I got to break it to you. We're never told that Lady Wisdom is standing in this particular place in the city of Jerusalem when she utters these things. Whereas when Jesus says this stuff, we're told like where he is. It's absolutely untrue. Jesus never looks like an allegorical figure in the Gospel of John. That's just wrong. So I actually think John is as historical as the synoptics, and they're all very, very historical. And if anything, John has this immense visual memory. And there's some similarity to Mark there too, that in Mark you have a lot of these unnecessary little details, but you just find this in John and little marks of authenticity. So, here's just one little one. I have so many in the book, but that when he's at the marriage of Cana, he says exactly how many jars of water and how many gallons approximately they each held. And it's like, it's not a round number. It's, and that they were made of stone. And we've actually found stone quarries near Cana where they made stone vessels because they didn't become ritually impure. So it like fits with the Jewish culture and everything. And archaeologically, we've confirmed this. So, it's this wonderful, then that's what I mean by the eye of the beholder. So yeah, I couldn't disagree more with that. As far as why they say that, well, get the eye of the beholder, because part of what I do there, my focus is I take arguments that have convinced evangelicals. So like that's what's different about my book. Nobody else has ever done this, as far as I know, for the Gospel of John, to go systematically through and to quote evangelicals, or those who at least have the reputation of being evangelicals or considered evangelicals. They get tapped to do arguments supposedly defending the reliability of the Gospels, and yet they're out there saying these things about John. Okay, what's convinced them? Because I think people think if you're an evangelical and you say, well, John's a horse of a different color. That's something Craig Evans said. You must have been convinced by overwhelming evidence, because after all, you're an evangelical scholar. Why would you say this if the evidence were not overwhelming? And so I'm saying, okay, what are their arguments? What is it that's impressing them or making them make these generalizations about John? And and are those arguments any good? And so, like, for example, I spend several chapters just on Johannine style, because Johannine style and the supposed style of Jesus language has been used as an argument that John is substantially less historical. So that's sort of a principle of organization of the book, and it makes it unique, and I think it will make it especially useful.
Excellent. Well, I cannot wait. And also, just keep in mind, there is some on the Gospel of John in the Mirror of the Mask. So again, I would get this ASAP. Makes a good Thanksgiving Christmas gift. And then you can be read up on it in time for the Eye of the Beholder, hopefully in spring. Now, I would like to definitely, and like I said, I'm hoping to get, again, your work out in front of a larger audience, if possible. You know, again, like we talked at before, just briefly, you know, I've worked with various people, you know, from, you know, William Lane Craig early on. I disagree with quite a bit of, of what he does now, but that beside the point. Discovery Institute, Logos Research Associates, tons of different, you know, secular groups as well as Christian groups. And again, I can't recommend your work enough. Again, moreover, I think it's very original. Again, I think when someone like John Warwick Montgomery, who was a signer of the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy, endorses it, I mean, that does say quite a bit. I think as far as, you know, where you stand, how it's being perceived, and I do think, you know, that there is these little groups, these niches, these, you know, clubs to where groups sort of kind of go and play in, whether it be progressive, whatever word we want to use. But I do recommend, you know, also anyone out there, don't be afraid. You know, I've been in a lot of these groups before. You know, I've, you know, met with a lot of these people, most of them. You know, put a rock in their shoe. Have them actually, you know, have them come face to face with some of the, you know, the work here, and show not just caricatures or hand waving, but have them actually, you know, address it forthright and come to the table. Don't just you know, put the Mcgrews, you know, oh, well, no, just whatever. No. Answer the question. Where is Lydia off here? And again, you guys have the YouTube, you have the Facebook, you've got LydiaMcgrew.com. Now I have gotten, we'll go straight in. I know we're running just a little over. It's not bad. We're in an hour 12, so we're 12 minutes over. That's, you're not, you can spare a few minutes, right?
Absolutely. And I wanted to say one more thing about the Mirror of the Mask. I wouldn't want anybody to think that, and especially if they see the size of it as you're picking it up there, you know, that it's a book this long and it's all negative. I really want to emphasize that this book, it's got whole chapters on positive arguments for what I call the reportage model, which is that sort of straightforward reading of the Gospels, and for why we should think that's true. And so I really want people to know also there are chapter summaries at the end of every chapter, and you can get it in Kindle also. So it's only, and that's only, you know, like $10, and it's fully searchable and everything. There are also, you know, full indexes and everything in the physical. But the point I want to make here is you can read those chapter summaries at the end, and then you can decide whether this is a topic you want to delve into in more detail. I give you permission to skip. You know, I mean, here I'm the author. The author's telling you it's fine to skip. And I really would not want anyone to have the impression that this is a 546-page rant, negative rant. It's not. You're going to find new undesigned coincidences in there. You're going to find new types of evidence that I call the argument from unexplained allusions, unnecessary details, the personality of Peter, the accuracy of the discourses in, I even have the section on the discourses in Acts, even though the book is on the Gospels. So there's a lot of cool positive material in there too. So I just wanted people to know that, and you can use the table of contents and the chapter summaries and everything to find that material in there if you want to focus on that.
Yes, and just again to kind of show that, I have a page dog-eared here because I was using it for a different project. If you can see it, the whole chapter is on overreading, and I think that happens a lot today. And then right next to it, summary, one page, bulleted, very easy to follow. I mean, even as just a reference, I mean, either way, very well put together. And again, like I said, I think that, I mean, my confidence, obviously in the reliability of scriptures after 20 years is pretty high anyway. But reading divine, even the hidden in plain view, some of those I'd actually had to go back and I was like, how did I always miss that? But it did nothing but increase it even more. So definitely, I couldn't agree more. All right, now to the Q&A. We have gotten a few new ones in, but here, we'll just jump right in. Well, you kind of touched on this one a little bit before. What would Lydia say to this quote from R.C. Sproul? Context aside, which you mostly agree with, quote, "It has often been charged that the Bible is full of contradictions. Such statements are unwarranted by the evidence. The amount of seriously difficult passages compared to the total quantity of material found there is very small indeed," end quote.
Yeah, I would. And I like that ratio idea that he's got going there, compare it to how much material we've got here. It's something I said in Hidden in Plain View. Let's not miss the forest for the trees. And that's why in Hidden in Plain View, I didn't talk a lot about contradictions. I said, let's look at the positive evidence and we can then put the alleged contradictions in against that backdrop and see that they start to look really, really small compared with all of the positive evidence for reliability.
We've got one here, Tim and Lydia. I would love to be a fly on the wall. Such great conversations must take place in your home. Do you ever have anything specific from a specific, if I'm reading this right, basically like a point within the New Testament where you're saying, you know what, no, I think this was, I think in the Gospel of Mark, I think this was John Mark. No, I disagree with you, Lydia. I think it's, or do you pretty much agree with about everything when it comes to scholasticism?
Well, of course, we're philosophers, so philosophers disagree about a lot of things. Since you ask about, the New Testament specifically, that's probably an area where we have way more agreements, than anything else. Like I can come up with something. Tim is a little more interested in the notion of protective anonymity, which is this idea that things might have been left out in order to protect people's people's anonymity from persecution or that kind of thing. So, for example, why aren't the people named who supposedly were the saints who rose from the dead in Matthew? And then he would say maybe protective anonymity. I've never met a protective anonymity argument I liked. I mean, literally every single one that's been brought up, I'm like, yeah, I don't think that's a good explanation. And so I tend to just take a much more robust stance, like, well, we don't know why they weren't named. Who knows why they weren't named? A lot of times we don't know why somebody doesn't name somebody. And so that would be an example in the New Testament. In philosophy, I think that God is timeless. Tim thinks that God is in time. Though he doesn't take William Lane Craig's view either. It's a different view, still yet a third view. It's really funny because he originally taught me to believe that God was timeless. And then we went forward 20 years and he changed his mind and thought God was in time. And I didn't change my mind. And I'm like, what? You're the one who taught me that God wasn't in time. Now you're changing your mind, So now I'm trying to bring it back to think that God is not in time. So, but we, this is not something that causes a problem in our lives or anything like that. We've been married since 1986. So, we definitely can handle disagreement.
Well, I agree with you on the timeless part, FYI. Let's see here. Well, you touched on that, so I guess I will bring that one up. Matthew 27:53 describes events that happened after Jesus' death. Norm Geisler, says that these should be read as literal, but Mike Lacona argues that they are figurative. Where does Lydia land, or does she have a point of view?
Yeah, I mean, definitely Matthew intended it to be literal. I don't think there's the slightest question. And, Mike Lacona will occasionally say, well, we say that something is an earth-shaking event, and that's just a figure of speech. So he likes to bring in figures of speech. But it's absolutely obvious that the earthquake in Matthew isn't a figure of speech. See, he's kind of using the fact that there's an earthquake there. But Matthew says he saw the earthquake. So, like, if you say this was an earth-shaking event, it's mentioning the centurion. When the centurion saw the earthquake, if you say, wow, that was really an earth-shaking event, you don't say, and when the policeman saw the earthquake, if you just mean it as a figure of speech. So I'd say it's obvious that Matthew means it literally. I think the reason that it strikes us a little oddly, and this, I may do a video on this sometimes, is that it's so short. It's amazing when you say to people, I've had people get this kind of aha moment when I say that to them, and I say, is the reason that seems weird to you that it's just so short? And that Matthew says so little, and you'd expect him to say more, like, what were their names? Who were they? Where did they appear? Who did they talk to? Tell me some conversations. And he doesn't do any of that. Now, I think that may indicate that Matthew had only secondhand reports of it. So maybe he didn't have all of those details. And so the account isn't as detailed, or it doesn't have those little marks of credibility that we could want, because Matthew wasn't there. He didn't meet any of these people. That's my theory, is that he's reporting it at secondhand, and that's why it's so short. And then that's being grabbed onto by people to say, ooh, that's weird, that's spooky, that's figurative. And what it really is, it's just a brief account of something that plausibly he didn't have a lot of other details of. So that would be my take.
Got it. N.T. Wright puts a lot of stock on the formation of the early church. Do you think he overplays this piece, or is his work solid and not question-begging?
Well, I don't want to make a pronouncement on the new perspective on Paul. So, that whole theological thing, I haven't studied. I suspect I probably would not agree with Wright on it from what I've seen, but somebody's going to say I'm misrepresenting him if I get into that. I'm not a theologian, but as far as the physical view, so this is how I'm going to interpret the question. It's talking about the Jews and their physical view of the resurrection. And that's certainly been helpful, because certainly some older liberal critics said Paul's referring to a non-physical resurrection when he says it is sown a earthly body and it is raised a spiritual body. That means it wasn't really a physical. And Wright has definitely debunked that by talking about the history of Judaism and, that they definitely believed in a physical resurrection. So I think that's very solid. I don't think it's going to do it all, everything that we need, and hopefully Wright would say the same. I do find that sometimes people will do a kind of a minimal facts plus N.T. Wright approach, because they still don't want to defend the reliability of the gospel accounts of the resurrection as being what the witnesses claim. So they'll go, okay, maybe we can't do everything with minimal facts. Maybe we can't do everything with minimal facts, so we'll add the empty tomb, and then we'll add N.T. Wright. Whew. I don't have to defend the reliability of the Gospels. I still don't think that's enough, but I think as far as it goes, N.T. Wright's work on Jewish views of the resurrection has been helpful.
Perfect. Is the Q document real in your viewpoint? I read Hidden in Plain View and loved it, but it kind of made me feel that you most likely believe in the Q document because there are so many relations that these coincidences would best be answered by Q. I'm a huge fan.
So that's a good question. When people ask me about Q, I say, well, I think there may have been an earlier version of Matthew. This is not ad hoc. So some of the theories about Q are pretty ad hoc, but the earlier version of Matthew is evidenced by the church fathers, because church father after church father says Matthew wrote in a Hebrew language. And people have tried to interpret this as a Hebrew style. I think that's strained. And we don't have a Hebrew Matthew. We don't have an Aramaic Matthew. We don't have anything like that. So right there, we've got independent evidence that there was an earlier version of Matthew. So it's possible that the role that gets played by Q, to the extent that it's reasonable, which is a very limited role, could have been played by a shorter, earlier document written by Matthew that focused more on the sayings of Jesus and didn't have as many contexts for them. Didn't tell that they were in discourse form or whatever, and that was just shorter. And it may be that that was something that Luke was dealing with. Now, I definitely don't think that answers any undesigned coincidences in any negative sense. I think the undesigned coincidences stand on their own, and I talk a little bit in Hidden in Plain View about the synoptic problem and how that doesn't undermine undesigned coincidences at all. But I'm probably a little more open to something that sort of stands in that Q-like place than some people are open. But I am very limited in that role that I assign to it, and I don't go out on a limb conjecturing all this stuff about what was in it. It's just a very limited role that would play.
Perfect. I was very impressed back in the day with the late Colin Heemer and his analysis of the book of Acts, where he argued meticulously for the incredible accuracy of the book of Acts, but today's scholarship would seem to distance themselves from this type of argumentation instead of going for the bare minimum. Does Lydia think Acts is high, medium, or low quality when you compare it to Paul's letters or the Gospels?
Well, of course, one of the Gospels was written by the same author, which would be Luke. And I think the way I would put it is that Acts allows Luke to shine even more than he has the opportunity to shine in the Gospel of Luke. And the way Tim has put it is that in Acts, we enter the larger world of the Roman Empire because of all the travel. So the author is the companion of Paul, and they're traveling all over the place. On Monday, I'm giving a talk for our local Ratio Christi group. And if you look it up on Facebook and you follow me on Facebook, I'll have a link there. They're going to stream it to YouTube, Lord willing. It had to be rescheduled from last week, and it's been going to be called Acts Gets Hard Things Right. Acts is just mind-blowing with the stuff that it has in it and the detail it has. And if anything, what this ought to do is give us this wonderfully high view of the accuracy of Luke, the gospel, because they're written by the same authors. So what we do is we move outside of that geographically narrow location, and then temporally Acts covers, I would say it's like in this wonderful Goldilocks zone. It covers more time than the Gospels, but it's a time that's contained within one man's lifetime where he could either witness the events or talk to witnesses. It's not hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's just enough for him to really show his stuff, but it's not so much where we know he had to get it at multiple removes. So Acts is it's amazing. It's wonderful. And get a hold of the book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by Colin Heemer. Yes, it's very scholarly. In some ways, it's very dense. But when I read sections on, other types of knowledge displayed in Acts, like 20 pages, page after page after page, I find my own faith being greatly strengthened. It's an amazing thing. So I'm going to be trying to bring some of that out in my talk on Monday, which will be streamed. So I hope people will pick up on that and watch that.
Excellent. Well, then this one came in late, but I'm going to go ahead and read it now because it kind of plugs into that. Can you buy a book package on your website with all 3 books? Is there a way to have you speak either at a church seminar or a Zoom meeting? Is best contact through Facebook?
Okay, so there's not a package right now. Of course, the Eye of the Beholder isn't available for pre-order yet, and Amazon won't let us do that until we have the final files uploaded. So, we have to get our endorsements. We have endorsements coming in every day, actually. I just had an endorsement come in yesterday. So we're gathering those, and then we have to put those into their typeset form before we can even make it available for pre-order. But I would encourage you, if you're looking for a deal, to get The Mirror of the Mask and Hidden in Plain View on Kindle, because that's really the most inexpensive. As far as my speaking, you can email me, lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Please introduce yourself. Don't use like a handle that's not a name or something. Tell me a little about yourself and your group and so forth. I do speak for groups. Now I don't travel. I don't jump on planes, and fly all over the place, but hardly anybody does anymore. So, but I definitely do Zoom meetings. Right now, I booked pretty much on into December, even for Zoom meetings. And I'm going to try to take a little time off around Christmas. But in the new year, in 2021, I can start doing some more Zoom meetings. So definitely get in touch with me and tell me what your group is looking for. And I can have different focuses on different topics. It doesn't have to be like exactly what I did with James here tonight. So yeah, definitely email me and ask me about that. That's a good way. You can Facebook message me. The messages, as you know, you don't have to be my Facebook friend, but sometimes they go off into some sort of cyberspace on Facebook, and it's a message request if it comes from someone who's not a Facebook friend. So email's probably a little better.
All right, just got a couple more here. Why is, I knew this one was coming. Why is Lydia not an inerrantist? Would the originals, if we have them from the hands of a prophet or apostle, be inerrant? Or are you saying even those would not, or could not, to clarify?
Well, definitely not could not. I mean, any document could be inerrant. I mean, the declarations of some health official online could be inerrant just in the sense that they don't happen to have any errors. I mean, my tax return could be inerrant. But so of course they could be, but this is not about the autographer. So if the question is, is my problem that there could be like some scribal error? No, that's not where it comes in. It's in the events that when there are some of these alleged contradictions and I'm not satisfied with any of the available harmonizations, then just looking at it historically, I'm saying it seems to me that it's plausible that someone made a good faith error here. And I sometimes give an example, and I'm not going to go on because we're running out of time, but that if you were listening to someone tell a story in court, you would still believe him and trust him if he were forced to admit, oh, that's right, that happened on another evening, because he could still be a very trustworthy person, but you would not trust him if he said, oh, yeah, I changed that on purpose, So my position ends up then being very inerrancy friendly, but it's just that I think that some of these are probably best explained as good faith errors. I do want to emphasize something here, though. Nothing in my case for the reliability of the Gospels or against the fact-changing literary devices uses the statement, the Gospel author made an error as a premise. So you can be an old style inerrantist and come in here and adopt all my arguments. You can adopt all my arguments against the fact-changing literary devices and for the reliability of the Gospels, and regard my position that there are some minor good faith errors as kind of a side issue. You don't have to say, well, wait a minute, does that mean I have to be a non-inerrantist in order to adopt Lydia's position on these literary devices? No, not at all. So it doesn't depend on that. So we need to distinguish something Lydia thinks from something that is crucial to her argument. Those are different.
And that would be, correct me if I'm wrong, for example, John Ward Montgomery, who is an inerrantist, and I believe he at least used to be like the head of like the president of like the Inerrancy Society or something. He found your book so good and credible that he endorsed it as an inerrantist, even though he understands you and him would agree to disagree on some of those points. Is that
That's exactly correct. I was very forthright with him, and I have been again and again, because I don't want anybody coming around and saying, you're hiding your position or something like that. So I really want people to know I'm being very forthright about that. And also, if you're interested in this, you can Google. I did a series of 2 interviews with Phil Fernandez of the Society for Inerrancy, and he's an old school inerrantist, good friend of Norm Geisler. And so he interviewed me on this, and we were very frank with one another. We had a very cordial discussion, and that two-part dialogue talks about this. Also, chapter 4 in The Mirror of the Mask talks about this as well.
Perfect. We've got 2 more.
Okay, 2 more. That's it.
2 more. Is the Jesus Seminar totally defunct now? It seems many evangelicals are oddly moving toward that direction, or at least Barthian. Oh, Karl Barth, Barthian. Would you agree or disagree?
Well, I do worry about statements I see where people will say, I believe this is a Christian, but as a historian, I couldn't affirm that. Or, you know, I affirm that as a Christian. This I think there's evidence for, but this would be going beyond the historical evidence. I do consider that that moves in a somewhat neo-Barthian direction, and it worries me a lot, actually. And I think it arises from this approach to the gospel where we take I call it the passage by passage approach. We take every passage and we go, oh, now I got to reset. Like, I don't know whether this is historical or not. I got to reset to amnesia. And each passage has to prove itself separately. And I'm going to have a whole chapter on that in The Eye of the Beholder, on that passage by passage approach and why it's wrong. Also, on my channel right now, I'm doing a discussion of miracles and their credibility as reported in the gospel, and kind of showing how we can go to individual passages, but without that amnesia, and while continuing to remember that the gospels are robustly reliable, and then bring that in an evidential sort of way. So I'm trying to counteract that neo-Barthianism, and I'm going to do a series. I'm planning to do a series on the virgin birth leading up to Christmas, because the virgin birth is one of those things that you'll see people say, I believe that as a Christian. William Lane Craig said this in a debate with one of the Hitchens, whichever Hitchens is the bullying atheist. I think that's Christopher. I believe that as a Christian, and I don't like that way of wording it. I think sometimes what they mean is, well, I have this other evidence about Jesus, and that's what makes me believe it. I don't think they should use that phrase if that's all they mean, but I'm going to argue that the infancy accounts in the Gospels are historically credible, and that the virgin birth is historically credible because of the credibility of the Gospels, not as a Christian. So.
No, that's perfect. And I know in one dialogue I had with Dr. Craig, and then it ended up becoming transposed into his question of the week, I kind of asked him the same thing. I kind of cornered him. This was originally when we had met a long time ago. But anyway, where I basically said, hey, you're always saying we must reference science in this specific cosmology and interpret scripture through it, kind of an eisegesis kind of a thing. And I said, but modern biology, to my understanding, virgins don't give birth. And then he said, well, that's simple. You jettison. And it's actually on his question of the week. It's his official, you jettison what modern biology says. And I'm like, well, that's convenient, but he's like, well, that's a core doctrine. And I'm like, well, but yeah, no, I agree 100%. All right, drum roll finale. Ending of Mark. Is it true that approximately 99% of all the manuscripts we have does include the longer ending? The problem is the two earliest ones we have, Sinaiticus and Botanicus, do not. Aren't they around 300s AD? If so, what does the church fathers? If so, what about the church fathers? I assume they mean, is there any allusion to like reference to a longer ending before Sinaiticus and Botanicus?
That's a fascinating question. You know what? I don't know the answer to that one, so I'm not going to pretend. I'm not a patristic scholar, and I haven't researched earlier references. I'm not going to affirm all of these specific, statistics that were given there, but I will affirm it is a majority text versus older text issue, and that the older text families do not have the ending. That long ending of Mark, and they are considered more reliable. But I also want to say that I think the long ending of Mark doesn't look like it belongs. I mean, I think there's more to it than just majority text versus older text. It looks like a summary. It shifts gear very abruptly. It's not stylistically similar to what comes before. The author appears to have access to the stories that are found in John, which is great. That's fine. And so to me, the most plausible scenario is that the original ending of Mark was lost. I don't think Mark actually ended there. And it drives me crazy when skeptics will say, well, Mark doesn't have any appearances of Jesus. You know, as if we have a complete original Mark. And he's like, and the women, man, they saw these, they saw these angels, and I darned if I know what happened next. I mean, that is not, we don't have any version of Mark like that. So I think that some portion of the original papyrus or codex or something was lost. And then I think someone, you know, felt the incompleteness. And this must have happened very early, though. So I wouldn't be surprised if we find patristic references to it, because I think whatever happened did happen early. And then kind of, you know, wrote an ending. Not that he was making stuff up, but he was using the other gospels and kind of summarizing them and putting them together to make an ending that made sense and rounded the book off, and wasn't trying to do anything wrong or anything, but just complete the book. And so to me, that's what it looks like. Like it's been ended by another hand that is making use of the other gospels to bring the book to a close.
Perfect. Oh, this one's short. It just came in.
Hey, you said that was the last one, man.
Matthew or Mark, which one do you think is the first? I assume Mark. Right?
Matthew in birth is Mark in priority. You know, I'm open to both. I think people should read John Wenham's book that argues for Matthew in priority. And if you think there's a good case for Mark in priority, read Wenham, because he makes a pretty good case for Matthew in priority, but that doesn't mean I believe in Matthew in priority either. And I will say that in working on the discourses in Matthew, I have the Mirror of the Mask has an appendix just on Jesus' discourses in Matthew. And in my work on the discourses, I became a lot more open to that separate source, like I referred to earlier, which might have been an earlier version of Matthew that isn't Matthew, the Greek Matthew that we currently have, that Luke might have been using. And the idea that Luke did not have access to Matthew as we have Matthew, and that this could then explain the overlapping material between Matthew and Luke. And that view is generally considered to, we might call it pair well, like they say about wine, with Mark in priority. So this would also, if Luke didn't have access to Matthew as we currently have it, this would also explain why Luke doesn't seem to know about the flight to Egypt. And I'm not saying he denies the flight to Egypt, he just doesn't seem to have heard about it. If he didn't, you know, obviously if he had Matthew, he's heard about the flight to Egypt. So it would explain a number of different things. So I suppose that maybe means I lean a tiny bit more toward Mark in priority, but to me, it's not a big deal. And I think we should rename the synoptic problem the synoptic puzzle. And the reason we should rename it is that it's not a problem. The synoptic problem is no problem. Because when it comes to historicity, we have evidence that Matthew has independent evidence from Mark, even if he did write second. And even if he did use Mark, he has independent evidence. Sometimes even in the very stories where he's using Mark, he's like, okay, yeah, fine, you know, I'll use Mark, but I'm going to add this detail that Mark doesn't have, you know, and we even have undesigned coincidences for those. So the synoptic problem is no problem. And therefore, who really cares whether Matthew in priority or Mark in priority is true? Because we're going to have arguments for robust historicity and substantial independence of the synoptics regardless.
Well, Lydia, Dr. Mcgrew, thank you so much. This has been very delightful. We were able to go through, oh my goodness, a ton of stuff. It was tiring just reading the questions. Thankfully, I didn't have to answer them. But again, I can't recommend enough. Go out there, LydiaMcGrew.com, subscribe to her YouTube, find her on Facebook. And with that, I think we are going to close for the evening. Guys, thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next time.
Thanks for having me, James.